Hey guys, what is up? Super Caveman Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Summer Split Finals overview and analysis video. This is what we've been working towards all split long up until this point, is the finals analysis, and I'm incredibly excited to get into it. Of course, only two teams remain in the summer split, one of which has not guaranteed their spot at the World Championships yet. Crazy how that ends up working out, but they do need to end up winning here today. The other team has guaranteed their spot at Worlds, but is looking for much more than that. Not only a spot at the international tournament, but a potential to complete the golden road at that international tournament. And so, a very important LPL finals here for the grand scheme of things. And of course, winning the LPL is still a major accomplishment in the resume of a lot of these players and these orgs that I'm sure they're going to want to fight for, but I'm interested to know what you guys thought of this series down in the comments section below. Who did you think was going to win it going into it? Did it play out as you expected? Was it closer or not as close as you anticipated? Would love to know your thoughts on both of these teams and just the LPL and the World's qualification system as a whole down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in the finals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the series, I will be giving out a finals MVP. Of course, we'll also be talking a bit, not only just about the World's qualification, because we will know our first two teams from the LPL to qualify for Worlds after this series with the automatic qualification system, but also we're going to be previewing the regional qualifier for a bit that is going to determine the other two that end up qualifying. So a lot to go over in this episode, and it's time we jumped right into it. We're going to be going over the finals matchup and previewing it real quick. It was a matchup between the number 2 seeded JD Gaming and the number 3 seeded LNG Esports. I think a lot of people saw JDG getting here pretty easily. It's certainly not a surprise to see the team that won spring and then won MSI and is now in the finals in summer be in the finals again, right? They have been so dominant over the course of this year, and it all was expected. They're a super team in every sense of the word. They've got a top, arguably 3 player in every single role on their team. They're the best team in the world until proven otherwise, and obviously they've been crazy consistent over the course of this year. Yes, they're going to drop some random games in the regular season. JDG in particular has always done that, but the best teams in the LPL, quite frankly, have always done that. We've very rarely seen like one team just utterly dominate. Of course, BLG came very close to that, but they couldn't get over JDG and then eventually dropping to their opponents today, LNG, in the semifinals. A lot of people did not see LNG getting here. I think JDG was a pretty clear favorite to end up in the finals as the best team in the LPL. I had them at number 1 in my power rankings all year long. They have not moved from number 1 since the preseason, but LNG, on the other hand, has had quite a volatile season in general. Obviously, in spring, they end up doing really well in the regular season, but their roster has some exploitable holes that are exploited in the playoffs, and they're not able to even get into top 4, which has to be considered a disappointment. But here, they end up bringing Gala into play in the bot lane, and it feels like everything has unlocked for this team. While they may have not been the most consistent in the regular season, their playoff run has been fantastic, culminating in that win over Billy. And you have to remember, these two teams did play before in round number 4. JDG was able to take it, but it was a 5-game series. It was very close between these two teams, and it certainly wasn't a blowout, and I think you could argue that LNG has gotten better since then, and so I'm really interested to see how this series plays out. It's going to be basically impossible to bet against JD Gaming predictions-wise going into this series, but LNG is looking really good. They look like the second best team in the LPL at the current moment, and that's a danger for JDG, especially matchup-wise. I think whoever ends up being the best player in this series is really going to matter towards how the outcome ends up playing out. But, of course, if we're going to go over the series, we get to do it game by game, and that means starting off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They are able to take the first game of this series. They're able to go up 1-0 in this matchup against LNG, and that's a major boon for them. I think getting the confidence and being able to kind of put yourself in a position where you've only got to win half of the games left in this series is so much easier than having to win 3 of 4 over the back half, especially against one of these two teams that are both very clinical with confidence at the current moment. Both of them have just kind of been on winning streaks and done a lot in the recent recent weeks. And so for JDG to come out and say, we beat you before, we're going to beat you in game 1 here to establish our dominance early, I think is really good. But this wasn't a dominating game. Like, yes, it was a 28-minute win, and maybe you can look at some of the stats and be like, yeah, JDG ended up being the better team here, but LNG had control of this game, and I think without a couple of mistakes towards the back half, they very well could have just straight up won this game. And I think that's a little bit frustrating for LNG, but again, proving that you can go toe-to-toe with JD Gaming, I think is a very tough task, and they have consistently been able to live up to that task. So let's start talking about JDG first and foremost. Basically, everybody on the team playing well towards the back half. They won the team fights that they needed to win, and I think that's where you're really going to give a lot of props to JDG, but my player of the game personally is going to go to 369 on the top side of the map. He has been phenomenal for them over the course of this playoff run. He's often the member of this team that kind of gets left behind in terms of the popular, I guess, public perception, if you will, on this JDG team. He's the one that's often left on weak side. He's the one that's often put in positions where he's not necessarily going to be a focal point with a ton of resources, but he has been so good in that role that honestly it's basically impossible to overlook at this point. He is the best weak side top laner in the world, and he still can carry games, and this Poppy game was actually phenomenal. Those ultimates towards the back half almost single-handedly ended up winning them this game, especially around the major objectives. He really was the most integral part of this team. He may have not been a damage carry, but setting everything up for the rest of the players on this team to actually be able to kind of capitalize on it, I think was the most important part. I think a lot of people are going to look at Knight as the player of this game on the Jace because of the 8 kills. And yeah, Knight was phenomenal in this game, and he continues to be a major damage threat, specifically in teamfights where he's been crazy consistent. Obviously, he's a great laner, but he's arguably the best team fighter in the entire world. Very, very close. I mean, Scout's obviously in that conversation. There are a couple of other players that I think definitely fall into that. Pays is definitely in that conversation, but Knight at least deserves to be mentioned in the conversation, and he continues to be really good on the Jace, but I wanted to give a lot of credit to the Poppy for being able to set up a lot of those plays. I think without 369, with the worst top laner in this game, it actually is a lot harder for JDG to be able to win. He rolled all 9s in game number 1 at the very least, but Knight was really good. Caster's really hyped up Ruler in this game. I don't think he was necessarily as good as maybe you would get if you watched the games, if you just watched the, the broadcast, but I do think Ruler was still pretty good, and obviously he doesn't make any sort of major errors. That one time where he was caught out and he ends up stopwatching to let the rest of the team collapse, it looks like a bait. It's a very good play coming in from JDG. You could consider it a mistake, but at the end of the day, it worked out, and so I'm not going to freak out, and he was really good in the team fights, and so give him credit for that. Missing was really good on the Alistair. Kanavi controlled the back half of the game on the Maokai, even if he wasn't all that perfect over the beginning part. I really do think, though, 369 and Knight are definitely the two members of the team that stood out the most to me in game number 1, and definitely the ones that I think gave them a lot of the confidence that they needed here. But then for LNG on the other side, you had this one. There were a couple of moments where it really felt like, okay, you're actually in the driver's seat in this game, mostly because they were dragon stacking. They were 1 away from Soul, which would have been absolutely massive for them. Obviously weren't able to get that because of that team fighting presence from JDG over the back half of the game, but I thought Zika and Tarzan in particular played really well over the beginning part of the game. The Cassante Wukong combo can actually be very difficult to deal with, and especially if Wukong's going to be moving all over the map. Tarzan typically is kind of mid on this champion, quite frankly. Like, he's not bad, he's just not been as good as he's been on, like, the Maokai and the Sejuani, in my opinion, on the Wukong, but he was really active in the early game here, and I think that was definitely to the benefit of LNG, and Zika was also really good on the Cassante, a champion that really can start to take over the game in the early to mid-game portion if you are able to invest resources. The problem was that Zika was just pushed up a little bit too far as a player. I think the mechanics were really good on Cassante, but there were multiple times where if he just kind of backed off and allowed, LNG to kind of group around him and put themselves in a position where he wasn't, exploitable, I think LNG could have won this game relatively easily, and I don't think that, unfortunately, was the case for Zika. Ends up getting caught out in multiple situations, and that does cost them a bit. Gala is going to get my dud of the game here. It felt like he was kind of irrelevant on the Xayah. He didn't really do anything all game long. I don't think he made any sort of, gargantuanly major errors, but the amount of damage that he was putting out was significantly less than everybody else in terms of, the main carries, especially on the side of JD Gaming, and I think it was pretty noticeable. Hang didn't really do anything on the Rakan either, and while a lot of people probably are going to give it to Zika Zika for some of the plays he made towards the back half. I think he was a pretty large reason why the team was in the game to begin with. And so for LNG, I do think that there are positives to take away from game number 1, but you do kind of have to win game number 2 now. You're not going to be able to win 3 games in a row against JDG, or at least you don't want to have to put yourself in that position. So tying up the series at 1-1, I think is going to be paramount for them. But for JDG, if you can establish that 2-0 lead, we already saw what they were able to do with it in that winners final series against BLG. They were able to close out series relatively efficiently, and that confidence is just going to be too much to overcome. So big game here in game number 2, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was LNG. They are able to take game 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and man, that's super crucial. Talked about it, obviously, at the end of that last game. You got to be able to win game number 2 if you're not able to take game 1 against JDG, because going down 2-0 against what is pretty clearly the best team in the world, at least at the moment, is very scary and very difficult to end up overcoming. But to be able to beat JDG, twice in 3 games, like, that's more possible. That is certainly something that is more doable, and LNG have certainly put themselves, I should say, in a position where they are capable of being able to do that, and I think that is obviously really, really big for them. They played this game number 2 a lot better, in my opinion. I liked their game 1. Like I said, there were definitely some moments, especially in the early game, where they were looking really good. Tarzan, I think, had a really good game. Zika had a couple of really good moments on the Cassante, and I think there was an opportunity for them to be able to try and create, some plays if they just didn't fumble the bag down the stretch of game number 1. But game 2 felt a lot more clinical from front to back, from start to finish, and I think that really is what you need to see from LNG. You need to see them being clinical. You need to see them being able to consistently be able to not only generate leads, but keep those leads throughout the game, because that's how you're going to beat JDG, is being able to establish dominance in the early game. Early game can be a little bit, I don't want to say wild in terms of, what it can do, but, like, if you have Tarzan, Scout, and Gala, like, you're not going to get outskilled in a lot of different matchups, even against a team like JDG. That's your avenue to be able to generate leads, because JDG is so clinical at being able to play from ahead. But LNG was a lot better in this game, and I think they did everything that they were supposed to do. They gave over a lot of objectives throughout the game, but for the most part, they were getting stuff for it. They were getting Herald. They were getting towers. And I think for the most part, that was the right decision. But for LNG, a lot of players, I think, really played well in this game number 2. But my player of the game is going to go to Gala in the bot lane. I know his scoreline isn't quite as flashy as some of the rest of this team. Hang had, 13 assists. Tarzan, 1-1 and 11, I think was really good. But when you watch the game, I think Gala's positioning and the way that he was able to play out some of these fights towards the back half of the game on Tristana, that was the difference maker. I think for LNG, they really needed that big carry, that AD carry, to step up and be that consistent damage threat. And I think Gala was so good in this game in terms of how he was positioning, being able to keep himself out of danger, but also being willing to play aggressive and to jump in and try to make plays. I think it really just was the perfect Tristana game, if you will, in terms of how he was able to execute. And for me, that is enough to give him the player of the game here in game number 2. But if you want to give it to Hang on the Leona, I totally understand. Really good game coming in from him to set up that Tristana for the most part over the course of this game. I mean, when you've got Rel plus Leona, it's actually very difficult for the enemy team to play from behind, because you're really in a position where if any of your members end up getting caught out, then you're in a really bad spot, because you're already probably not going to have an easy time winning 5v5, let alone 4v5, and so you really need to make sure that you're positioned well. And when you've got basically a pick comp here with Annie ult, with Varus ult, Sejuani and Poppy looking for things, Alistar trying to engage, it's much more difficult to play that game from behind already. And so for LNG, you're actually in a really interesting spot to be able to give yourself everything you need to win the team fights towards the back half of the game, and I think they did a really good job of being able to execute on that. Gala obviously needing to step up, but Hang, I think, did a really good job in that same vein. Tarzan was really good this game on the Rel. He was been really good over the first 2 games of this series. Honestly, he's been a little bit better than Kanavi, in my opinion, through the first 2, and Tarzan was somebody who was receiving a lot of criticism from the community over the course of this year. Obviously, a lot of that I've talked about on this channel has been relatively unjustified. You're allowed to have a couple of bad games in the regular season if you step up when it matters the most, especially considering for the most part he still was really good in the regular season, and he's coming off an all-pro, arguably best jungler in the league split in spring, and so I'm certainly not going to sit here and criticize him too much, and he's been awesome in this playoff run for them. Scout obviously has been the carry for them, and I think he was definitely the better mid laner in this game, but, it's just LeBlanc. She's going to be popping in and out, dealing a lot of damage, setting things up for the rest of the team to end up bopping the team fights, and then Zika was still really good on the Cassante, even if 369 on the other side was actually the best player on JDG when it came to what they were able to do. But good win from LNG, and JDG's got some concerns here. Like, I'm not going to freak out, but it really does feel like their main carries are not particularly stepping up in a way that has been, you know, what they've been able to do over the course of the playoffs up until this point. Kanavi's been the best player on JDG in summer, and Tarzan's just straight up been better through the first 2 games. Now, do I expect that to be able to continue throughout an entire series? Probably not, and it's, you know, I certainly am not going to bet on it, but it's certainly something that we need to see turn around. I think Knight was really poor in this game. He's going to get dud of the game on the Annie. Basically, no ultimate ended up mattering from that champion, and if that's the phrase that you're using when talking about Annie, then she didn't have a very good game. She wasn't very impactful, and you can blame Knight for some of it. You can blame the game state for some of it, but whatever reason, Knight was not useful this game really at all, and he definitely deserves dud of the game. Ruler, I think, has just kind of been meh over the course of this series. The Aphelios game was fine. Certainly wasn't awful. I think he played some of the late team fights really, really well, but I really don't think he was all that useful on the Varus. And missing, I think, was okay on the Alistair, but when you're looking at the positives for JDG, it again continues to be 369 on the top side, who had a really good game on the Poppy. A lot of those ultimates, and even just Poppy existing, being able to, you know, block dashes and block engages and make it a lot more difficult for a lot of these players to end up playing the game. I think Poppy actually was super useful, and it continues to be a very useful pick for JDG. I would expect them to want to continue to go towards it, you know, for the rest of this series, and I think that it definitely showed its merit again here in game number 2. But for JDG, you need to find ways to be able to consistently deal damage in a lot of these team fights, and if you get behind early, I think that's actually going to be a little bit of a problem for this team. They're not bad at playing from behind, but LNG is very good at playing from ahead, and so I do think that, again, generating pressure in the early game is going to matter, and a lot of that's probably going to be on jungle mid duo. So for JDG, getting back on track is going to be important here in game 3, but if LNG can take a lead here, that's actually going to be major for their confidence. And so who's going to be able to take the game in game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are able to take game 3, and now they are officially 1 game away from being your 2023 LPL Summer Split champions. Wild stuff coming in from LNG. I think a lot of people wrote them off even just going into the playoffs. I saw people picking them to lose to Weibo in their first playoff series, and now they're 1 game away from being champions. Wild stuff coming in from LNG, and quite frankly, this game was dominant. I mean, this was just LNG from moment 1 to the end of the game. This was easily the most dominant performance over the course of the series up until this point, and you've got to give them all of the credit for that. They've been really, really good in these games, and the players that need to step up have absolutely been stepping up. They've been so consistent over the course of this series, and even in game 1, where they did lose, they had an opportunity to win that. I mean, a couple of things go differently in game number 1, and this could be a 3-0 sweep for LNG, which is wild to say. To even be in the conversation for that is absurd, and just shows you how much this team has upgraded themselves going into not only this series, but over the course of the back half of this year. We were talking about them as potentially not even a top 4 team heading into playoffs, and now they really are, like, clearly a top 2 team in the LPL. BLG, you know, give them a lot of credit. They've been really good over the course of this year, but LNG has just been better than them over the back half of this split, and they are continuing to prove that they deserve to be taken seriously here in the playoffs. Really good stuff from this team. Player of the game for me is going to go to Scout. All of the people who said that he didn't deserve MVP, I mean, I gave it to someone else technically, but he was second in my voting. I absolutely said that it was deserved. I was not concerned at all. What I was concerned with, and I tweeted this out at the time, was the fact that Scout won MVP and then didn't get first team All-Pro. The hell is that about? Like, how does that make any sense? Like, I don't understand how the LPL voting system works. I get that MVP is just the most amount of player of the games, but like, come on. Like, if your MVP has to be first team All-Pro, that is an absurd thing to not have picked. But whatever. Like, Scout's been awesome in the playoff run. I think that you could argue that Scout has been the single best player in the playoffs across any team. Like, he's just been the best player in the playoffs. He's been the best player in the regular season. He's kind of been the best player in the LPL in 2023, which is not what I expected going into the year. As good as Scout has been over the course of his career, I think there is an argument to be made. And honestly, I don't even know if it's an argument. I think it's just kind of a fact. This is the best year of Scout's career, which is crazy considering it's the first year that he really left Edward Gaming. And so really, really good stuff coming in from him. He was awesome again on Azir, and he's emerged as one of the best players in the world. He's a top 3 to 5 player in the world at the current moment, and that's amazing to say. He's right up there with Chovy and Knight for best mid laner in the world, in my opinion. But LNG is more than just him. I think that's really kind of the big positive. Tarzan has been spectacular across this series. I've hyped him up a lot through the first 2 games. He had another really good game on the Maokai here. This is a champion that he pilots at a very high level. The Sejuani. These are the things that I really think of when I think of Tarzan, and he continues to just make it such an impact. He wins early so consistently going into a champion like Rel, who, if you get behind on Rel, it's so much more difficult to play the game because Rel's got one mode, and that's go in. And especially with a Tristana, even an Alistair, like, if you're not going in, then that champion's just, like, really useless. And so, really good stuff from Tarzan to put her in a position where she can't really go in all that consistently over the back half of the game. She's mostly going to be used for peel on Knight and on Ruler, and I think Tarzan was just significantly more useful. Zika was awesome on the Crocodile. What a draft to pick Renekton into. I mean, look at the comp from JDG. It's outside of Gragas, full AD, and just in general, like, I think Renekton really does well into the champions that JDG ended up picking, so Zika looking good. Gala's been crazy consistent. Hang has been very good. LNG is just clicking right now, and honestly, through the first 3 games, they are the better team in this series, which I don't think a lot of people would have expected going in. But for JDG, it's panic mode now. You're 1 game away from being eliminated and having your dream of the Golden Road dashed here, which would be disastrous for this team, but you need to get your head in the game. It doesn't feel like JDG is really connected in the same way that they have in a lot of the other series, which is crazy considering it's the finals. You would imagine that they would be incredibly locked in for a performance like this, but it feels like they're just not playing at a high level in the early parts of the game. Kanavi and Knight in particular have really struggled in the middle part of the series. Games 2 and 3 have been really bad from the 2 of them, and they were the 2 that I think really pushed this team forward the most in the regular season. Kanavi and Missing, I think, were really the 2 best players on JD Gaming, but Knight was also obviously really good in the regular season, and especially when he was locked in, he was incredibly solid, and he's been a major force for them in the playoffs. He's been their best performer in the playoffs, him and 369. But for both of them to struggle as much as they have been over the course of the beginning of the series is certainly concerning. But dud of the game for me in Game 3 is going to go to Ruler. He's been not all that good in this series. A couple of moments where I think he's been, solid, like the back half of game number 1, the team fight stage in particular. Of Game 1, he was good, but Game 2 was very up and down. Didn't really love the Varus, didn't think it really did all that much. And then there's really no excuses, basically, for game number 3 here. This was a bad Aphelios game. Bad gun control, bad activity on the map, not really respecting the enemy team's damage. Just not a very good game coming in from Ruler, and this is very rare from a player like him. He's so consistent as an AD carry. To see him struggle so much in this game, it's certainly not something I expected, but overall, I think JDG's in a little bit of trouble. Their confidence seems to be a little bit broken here, and LNG, quite frankly, has just kind of outplayed them, especially in the early game of this series. If that happens again, it's likely going to be LNG's series to lose. So JDG now in a position where they've got to win both of the final 2 games in order to keep their dream of the Golden Road alive. Are they going to be able to do it, or is LNG going to shock the world and become your 2023 Summer Split champions? Well, we're going to find out, at the very least, how it starts here in game number 4, because the winner of game number 4 was JD Gaming. They are able to take game number 4. They're going to be pushing this series to a Silver Scrapes game 5, and we are getting a full series here in the LPL finals, and this is what we all really wanted, I think. We wanted to see both of these teams step up. We wanted to see both of them be able to go head-to-head and keep up with each other. We wanted a fun series between these two, and I absolutely believe that we got it here in this one. Of course, going to game 5, it's going to be interesting, but both of these teams have looked good at different parts in this series. Of course, JDG taking game 1, but LNG through the first 3 games looked really solid, but game 4 very firmly in favor of JDG, and very firmly in favor of a player that has absolutely stepped up when it's mattered the most in a lot of different circumstances for this team this year, and that being my player of the game, Knight, in the mid lane, who is so good, man. At some point, we're going to have to just be like, yeah, this guy steps up when it matters. He is a big game player. I know that there is this preconceived notion, this wrong notion, quite frankly, that he has fumbled the bag in big moments in previous seasons. I think that because his team hasn't necessarily had success in previous seasons in big moments, people think that Knight is the one that is causing that. And even then, I think a lot of this is stemming from, 2020 Worlds, where Top Esports didn't end up doing as well as some people may have thought, but not doing as well as some people may have thought was them getting to semifinals at Worlds, top 4, which is crazy to me that expectation was just kind of there. But Knight has been really good at international tournaments as well, and he continues to be a major performer in the LPL playoffs, and he was really good in this game. His signature RE, the champion that I think most people would associate Knight the most with, at this point. He pulls it out here in a do-or-die game 4, and he carries on it. He does so much damage, he's setting up everything else for the rest of his team. It was just a phenomenal game, coming in from a player that really needed to step up and have a phenomenal game. If Knight is going to play like this, like, anything can happen in game number 5. As good as Scout has been on the other side of this, again, like I said earlier, you can argue that Scout has been the best player in the playoffs so far in the summer split for any team. Knight is one of the only players, maybe the only player in the LPL that can truly go head-to-head with him when both of them are playing at their best, and that is really, really fun. That's what we wanted to see here in the finals. We wanted to see this kind of matchup, and we really are getting it. But Knight really was terrific. If they don't have Knight in this game, they probably don't end up winning it, which is pretty wild. I know the rest of the team did play well, but he was setting everything up for them. I do think the rest of the team was good. Kanavi had a much better game on the Wukong. This was the first game where it really did feel like he was actually able to establish any sort of pressure in the early game, which I think definitely matters for Kanavi. He's usually so good at that. He's so consistent at being able to establish that pressure that the fact that he wasn't able to do that throughout the series was definitely at least a little bit concerning, but he was really good in this game, and so that's good to see. 369 continues to play, you know, champions that he's known for, like the Gragas, and do well, but Ruler and Missing I thought were significantly better in this game. This is a duo that has honestly kind of struggled over the beginning part of this series, and I do think that game 4 was really the moment where they did start to step up and be a lot better, but at the end of the day, there was a carry in this game for JDG, and his name was Knight, and if he's going to be able to play like this, it's going to be so much more difficult for LNG to win. And then for LNG on the other side, this was your worst game of the series, and that's okay. You're allowed to have one game where you do just kind of get blasted by JD Gaming, like you're allowed to have that. I don't think that it was particularly close really at any point in this game. In fact, it really did feel like the exact opposite of the beginning part of the series, especially game 3, where it was like LNG was not really able to establish any pressure early, even though they were getting objectives and they couldn't really translate it into anything. That had been JDG a lot in this series, and so to see it happen to LNG is certainly funny. See the roles kind of reversed, but nobody particularly played well in this game. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Gala. They end up flipping Baron towards the back half of this game, and if the Jinx had, like, any damage at all, maybe they would be able to win that fight and win that exchange, but the Jinx was doing so little in that fight. When Jinx isn't excited, it's actually very difficult for her to be able to deal any sort of consistent damage, and even if Gala individually didn't make any sort of major errors, I think the fact that he was doing so little in the grand scheme of things was a big reason why LNG actually didn't have a ton of pressure towards the back half of this game, and so Gala's gonna get Dud of the game, but Tarzan got out jungled for the first time in this series, and, you know, Tarzan's been really good over this playoff run, but Kanavi is bound to win one game, right? Like, he's bound to be able to do something in this matchup, and so not entirely surprised there. Scout was not nearly as good as Knight in this game, and was certainly getting out pressured in that department. Hang wasn't very good, Zika wasn't very good, etc., etc. LNG had their first, like, actual, like, concrete loss of the season, or the series, I should say, not the season. What am I talking about? Of the series, but LNG definitely has to bounce back now. We are now going to a do-or-die Game 5 in the LPL Finals. This is what it's all built up for. This is the big moment in the LPL Finals for both of these teams. If LNG wins, they guarantee themselves a spot at Worlds, and they are the LPL champions. If JDG wins, the Golden Road stays alive, and they have the chance of perfection on this year, which would be insane. So major stakes coming in this final game, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of Game 5 and your LPL Summer Split champion was JD Gaming. They are going to take Game 5. They are going to secure their LPL title, and they are going to secure their spot as the #1 seed from the LPL at Worlds. The Golden Road is very much still alive, and I don't want to harp on that too much. I know people are going to get very tired of hearing that narrative going into international events, but man, JD Gaming is so damn good. This might be the single best League of Legends team that we have ever seen. They really are going to have to be in that conversation, and they've done it again. They are your Summer Split champions. Congratulations to them. LNG put up a hell of a fight and really did take them absolutely to the brink. I know this game number 5 wasn't as close as any of the other games in the series. You know, it's unfortunate that it ends with a little bit of a blowout in favor of JDG, but LNG more than held their own in this series, and a couple of things go right for them in Game 1. We're talking completely differently about this series and about just everything in general with the LPL right now, because LNG could have swept them 3-0 had things gone a little different in that Game 1, but that's not the universe we live in. The timeline we do live in is JD Gaming as, again, your 2023 Summer Split champions, but In this game, they just played super duper well. They did everything that they were supposed to in this one, and you've got to give them a lot of credit for that. Player of the game and player of the series for me, my finals MVP is going to go to Knight in the mid lane. He was so crucial, so integral in what this JD Gaming team wanted and needed to do throughout this entire series. In game 1, he was the damage threat on that Jace. He was the one that ended up winning a lot of those team fights at the back half of the game that did end up bringing that game home for JDG. In game 4, he almost solo carried the game on Ahri, a fantastic performance, and now in game 5, he gets on the Nico, and he sets up every single play that JDG ends up going for towards the back half of this game. They don't win this series without Knight. Like, in my opinion, it really is as cut and dry as that, and I know people are going to continuously find ways to, dissuade and downplay his ability as a mid laner, as they have done for his entire career, but there is no denying it anymore. He is a top 2 at, 3 at worst, probably player in the world. Like, there really is no more denying it. I think he's the most talented player on JD Gaming, which is not an easy thing to do with Kanavi and Ruler and 369 and Missing, who are all some of the best players in the entire world. But Knight is just built different. He really is that good. And if he can continue this run, if they complete the Golden Road and, he does end up being, amazing internationally, I think he's got a conversation. He's now in that conversation for one of the greatest of all time. Obviously, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but he is already in the conversation, in my opinion, for one of the greatest LPL players of all time. Nobody has really had the kind of peak career that Knight has had. Obviously, there have been a couple of players, Clear Love and Uzi, I think definitely come to mind, but in terms of the modern era, Knight is probably the greatest modern player in LPL history, and I think he continues to prove that in a series like this. Kanavi was awesome towards the back half. Don't want to overhype his performances too much, because again, in the first 3 games, he really wasn't all that good for this team, but games 4 and 5 were fantastic from him, and those are the games that really do matter at the end of the day, and so good to see him step up. But 369 really was super spectacular for this team throughout the entirety of the playoffs, and he's a big reason why they are walking out of this series with a win. Without him in game number 1, I think that series is a lot more difficult for LNG to lose. I think that, we're talking about how LNG was very close to a 3-0 sweep. 369 was really the one, in my opinion, that stopped them. 369 and Knight, I think, were the 2 players in that game 1 that really did make a difference, but Ruler and Missing had, uncharacteristically off days. Missing not necessarily as much. I think Ruler was arguably the worst player on JDG in this series, which is not really all that good for this JDG team to see, but to have Ruler not necessarily performing at the highest level and still be able to beat an LNG team, that is a very big positive. And so, basically everything you could have wanted from JDG in this series ended up happening, and they're going to be moving on as the number 1 seed. But for LNG, it's heartbreaking. You weren't able to get the job done. You were up 2-1, and you just couldn't close out the series against JDG, but man, you really pushed them to their limits. There's nothing to be ashamed of if you are LNG in this series. Unfortunately, because of the way that things do end up working out, this team is not guaranteed a spot at Worlds. They do have to go into the regional qualifier. Because JDG ends up getting that automatic qualification spot, it's up to championship points to determine the second team that does qualify, and Billy just has more championship points. So BLG is locked in. LNG is going to have to go to the regional qualifier. We'll talk about that a bit at the end of this, but this game number 5 was unfortunate. I think Scout played really well on the Jace, was generating some momentum in the mid lane, trying to take advantage of that early laning phase, but Kanavi had just beaten Tarzan in the jungle matchup, so the map pressure just wasn't there for the Jace to be able to destroy it, and I do think that bot lane in general kind of collapsed over the back half of this series. Gala's going to get my dud of the game here on game number 5. The Ziggs didn't work out. If you're going to pick Lilia, I'm surprised to see you also pick Ziggs. You're very counterable, in my opinion, when you pick a comp like this with Renekton and with Sejuani and Alistair, and it's really easy to build towards the late game if you have so much AP damage on the side of LNG. Again, I've actually praised LNG a ton over the course of this year for being really the only team in the East, really, to be willing to give picks like Ziggs a shot in the bot lane, because I do think they're really good right now with Jace and Tristana and a lot of these AD mid laners being so prevalent, but I'm not necessarily sure this was the game to bring it out in. I don't think Gala played particularly well over the back half, and that's unfortunate. Hang, I don't think really did all that much in the series, and Zika probably had his worst game of the series here in game number 5, but Scout continued to step up. Tarzan had a good series. I think Zika, for the most part, had a good series outside of this game number 5, and I think both bot lanes, quite frankly, kind of disappointed in this series. It really was a jungle mid difference in basically every game that ended up being won by either team, and I think that that is definitely something to look at for both of these teams. But for LNG, LNG, that's going to be the end of their summer split. They're going to have to go into the regional qualifier now, which I'm sure they're pretty frustrated by. No turnaround. They've got to play EDG tomorrow, which is crazy in terms of how that ends up working out. But I do think that they've done everything they need to do to generate enough confidence to get themselves to the World Championships. If this team is not able to be in the top 4 in terms of the LPL, that's going to be an absolute travesty because they've done everything that they've needed to do. But again, congratulations to JD Gaming. They're going to be moving on now to, the World Championships. They're the LPL champions, so the #1 seed heading in, and really, really excited for this team. Obviously, there's going to be a ton of pressure on this org and on these players going into that international tournament because of just how dominant they have been over the course of this year. But if there's any team that I truly do believe can complete that golden road, can make everything right, can live up to those expectations, I really do believe it's going to be this JD Gaming team. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Finals overview and analysis video. Of course, as you can see, the 2 teams that have now officially qualified for the 2023 World Championships just through championship points without going through the gauntlet are up on the screen. Your #1 seed and your both spring and summer champions, as well as your MSI champions, are JD Gaming. Talked about them a ton. Nobody is surprised to see them in this spot. They have not moved from #1 in my power rankings all year long, but the #2 seed is going to be Billy Gaming. Finishing 3rd here, getting obviously 2nd in the spring split means that they are the team that has the most championship points outside of JDG, which means they are the team to auto-qualify in 2nd place as the #2 seed from the LPL. Obviously, some reservations about this team, a little bit more than expected because of that loss to LNG, but remember, going into playoffs, this felt like the obvious 2 that we wanted to see internationally from the LPL. BLG still has more than enough firepower to be able to figure things out. And if they get even remotely close to the form that they were at in the regular season, this is going to be a team that genuinely can win the World Championships. I know that maybe people are going to be a little bit lower on this team because of the playoffs, but I still think that they are incredibly dangerous and they more than have earned their spot going to the World Championships. But that means we know the 4 teams going into our Worlds qualifiers as well. We have the bracket up on screen now. Of course, the matchup tomorrow is going to be LNG Esports taking on Edward Gaming. The winner of that will become the #3 seed from the LPL at Worlds. The loser will move on to one more game to face the winner of Top Esports and Weibo Gaming. If I did have to give some quick predictions, I would guess that LNG is able to get the job done and be the #3 seed as they should be, especially with how close they play JDG. I have a lot of confidence that that team is really peaking at the right time and is going to be able to make Worlds. But as for that 4th spot, I really do not know. I think any of the 3 teams could go on a run and end up getting it. If I have to go off of consistency, I would say Top Esports would be my pick to get that #4 seed. I expect them to be able to take down Weibo, and they've already shown that they're able to beat EDG, but again, if EDG is able to take down TES, or if Weibo's just able to get hot at the right time and make a dangerous run, remember, this is a team that has not lost a single game to JDG all year long and has beaten, took LNG to 5, who just went on to, really make some noise and do some damage in the playoffs. And so really any of these 3 teams I think could get that #4 seed, but I think LNG should definitely be favorites to get that #3 seed. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. What 2 teams do you think are going to qualify as the 3 and 4 seeds out of the LPL? And how do you think these 4 teams are going to do at the World Championships? Would love to know you guys' thoughts. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and playoffs are rolling in basically all of them. Worlds is just around the corner. If you want a lot of previews on the teams that are going to be playing internationally, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe, hit that bell, so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.